All right, our next speaker is Sarah Smith. Sarah works for SLR Consulting, however, has been working as a fauna ecologist on closure criteria for the Ranger Mine for a little while now. And Sarah will be presenting on the development of fauna closure criteria for the Ranger Mine. Please welcome Sarah.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm talking a little bit about a project that SLR did in collaboration with ERA and some of the key stakeholders over the last year or so. During development of the 2020 mine closure plan, we were engaged to review, update and hopefully improve the closure criteria related to fauna species that had been presented in 2019. In the 2019 closure plan, there were 4 criteria that were related to fauna, and they'd largely just been carried over from quite old iterations of the mine closure plan, and they were quite broad. So we were engaged to review the published literature around closure criteria, around fauna in post-mining landscapes, and around ranger specifically, to consult with some of the key stakeholders, and then to integrate that information into some closure criteria to go into the plan, which is the vehicle for getting like a formal agreement between regulators and the mine on how closure is going to actually be deemed successful in the long term. So this was conducted in parallel with a lot of other work in other domains. So we've heard a lot about what's happening with plants and vegetation communities already. There's also work going on around how the water's going to work on the final landform, what the landform itself is going to look like, radiation and a variety of other different themes for rehabilitating the mine site as a whole into what we want it to be. So the key references that we used for this project included a couple of reviews that have been done over about the last 10 to 12 years. During this time, it's been realised that the long-standing paradigm that if you plant some plants, you will get some animals and that's acceptable has been challenged. And so there's a couple of reviews that look at how fauna come into rehabilitated mine sites or other sites, and what criteria are suitable for actually understanding when you've reached a similarity to your surrounding landscapes that's acceptable. We looked at the relevant publications about ecology of fauna in tropical savanna landscapes and reviews of fauna in existing recolonisation projects where that data exists. It's really important to note that a significant body of work has actually been conducted on the ranger site specifically. So the key references for this include some work done by the NT government, CDU, and in collaboration with some of their stakeholders. So there were these series of 3 reports that were published. One of them addresses vertebrate assemblages, and it talks about both what species are important and how to determine statistically whether your similarity is acceptable to surrounding landscapes or not. There is a report specifically about what invertebrates are important at Ranger, and then Alan Anderson's combined all of these into an overarching set of standards recommended for the mine closure of Ranger, and he's presenting his work, I believe, tomorrow at 2:40. So he's got a much broader discussion of how these studies were conducted and what the goals and the outcomes more broadly than just closure criteria were. So in terms of getting closure criteria written up to be included into the 2020 mine closure plan, we discussed some issues with like a limited amount of key stakeholders who we thought had enough information and background to provide useful input into this mine closure plan that then becomes public. So the issues that we addressed ranged from quite broad things. So what kind of parameters do we actually want to look at to understand how the final landform's performing in terms of fauna? What's the useful approach to actually setting those criteria? What the criteria might actually be, and then specific technical issues around what species do we consider good habitat for fauna. So those consultations identified quite a lot of areas of agreement. So there's quite a large area of agreement between all the stakeholders about the real must-haves for this ecosystem, there are some still areas of disagreement about what's important and what's achievable. So that brings us to this slide, which is an important background piece to the work that we've done. So closure criteria are incorporated into the mine plan and become part of the agreement between a proponent and regulators. So there's a lot of competing sort of demands, even though everybody wants the same best outcome. There are some criteria some characteristics that you really need to have for a criterion to be successful. So they have to be achievable. It needs to be something that is entirely feasible to be achieved by the mining company. We don't want to set them up to fail. They have to be meaningful. There's no point in investing resources into rehabilitating a site to meet a criteria that's not actually meaningful in terms of the environmental outcome. They have to be acceptable to stakeholders. The stakeholders are the key end users of the site. Criteria need to be able to be robustly and statistically significantly monitored and assessed. They have to be manageable. That means that you have to be able to assess your progress towards achieving a criteria and modify that if you need to. They can be direct or indirect measures. So that means it might be the actual presence of animal species, or it might be to do with the provision of resourcing. And in combination, you want enough criteria that are sufficient to demonstrate that the community is recovered. So the broad themes that came up in discussion with stakeholders and in reading the existing literature were that we needed criteria that addressed both the presence of invertebrate species and vertebrate species. Over and above general abundance, diversity and composition, we need some recognition that there are particular species that may be worthy of their own set of criteria, and they may be for culturally significant species, groups of species, or for environmentally specific species. Criteria probably also include some measures of fauna habitat, because that's something that will actually become apparent prior to recolonisation by some species, and it facilitates that recolonisation. And then pest species, as Meg talked about earlier, some of the trees are contraindicated, and there are some pest species that we want to keep out of the final landform. So within each theme, we identified potentially useful measurable criteria. So we came up with a list of criteria for each one of these parameters or broad themes. So in terms of what species occur, we're looking at a combination of metrics to understand, are we getting a diversity of species? Are they occurring at similar richness to other landforms that are acting as our baseline? And are we actually seeing functional diversity? So do we have animals that are in there that are actually filling their ecosystem service roles that we want to see filled? In addition to the actual presence of species, we've got fauna habitat. We addressed a variety of different things, and some of these were resolved to be useful and some of them potentially not in a tropical savanna landscape. For example, leaf litter and coarse woody debris is very difficult to track over the long term, given the fire frequencies that we have in these landscapes. But fruit-bearing plants indicate that there are resources available for species that are transiting or living in the site. We looked at hollow-bearing trees, which potentially are hosting groups of fauna that otherwise won't occur. And we looked at potential artificial habitats, so potentially installing nest boxes to facilitate the occupation of the site by species that otherwise wouldn't be present. Significant species, we looked at environmental and cultural significance of species, and then pests. So when we break this down into specific measurable criteria, each one of which will have a target similarity to the reference ecosystems, we ended up with a whole set of criteria. Now, ultimately, each one of these will have a target value that we can measure performance towards an achievement of. So once we broke them all down, we ended up with 21 criteria. So that was our initial draft of, from those 4 criteria that we had in the 2019 mine closure plan, what are we going to put into the 2020 mine closure plan? So these criteria were assessed by ERA, and they were narrowed down to 9 criteria, which were considered as the must-haves. 2 of these criteria were also addressed, but they sort of fall under the flora criteria. So they're things to do with species of plants that might have fruit or nectar. So the criteria that were identified are these 9 that were included in the final mine closure plan for 2020. So we had exotic fauna, so we don't want to have pests, habitat connectivity, which was something that wasn't raised by the stakeholders and haven't been addressed quite broadly in closure criteria for fauna. We had native fauna richness and diversity for vertebrates and invertebrates, functional diversity of vertebrates and invertebrates, and target species. There's a bit of a placeholder here. It was broadly agreed that target species for environmental characteristics would be threatened species. So they're species that would occur at low densities otherwise and might not be suitable for monitoring. But it's recognised that because of their status, it's important to actually monitor them specifically. We've also got a bit of a placeholder for culturally significant fauna because we need input from the appropriate people to understand what those might be and where they might be occurring in the landform. So following from the 2020 mine closure plan, we're aiming to progress these towards a set of criteria that can be agreed. So the supervising scientist branch was kind enough to host a workshop for further development of these closure criteria, and they had some really key stakeholders all in one room talking and discussing what we think more, what additional improvements can be made on this list. We're also planning to hold a workshop, or supervising scientists is holding a workshop later this month about how we understand if these metrics are suitably similar to surrounding landscapes. So this is my take-home list from the workshop. So the work that's been done there hasn't been fully written up and hasn't been fully finalised yet, but the areas of consensus overlapped pretty well with some of the criteria that were in the 2020 mine closure plan. There are a couple of criteria in there that that we broadly agreed wouldn't be useful. So that there was a point about connectivity of habitat, and it's actually thought that's probably not useful criteria. It's almost a background must-have. It's not an actual criteria, and it's particularly not a criterion related to fauna. So we've got these. So we've got this sort of broad list of criteria that have been derived from existing literature, have been derived from studies done at Ranger and from consultation with stakeholders, and we'll progress these further to agree on the criteria that will go into the 2020 mine closure plan and eventually will become the accepted criteria for the site. Now, you'll see that the level of background information about fauna is significantly different to what we've seen about the revegetation. So there are some issues that have been resolved largely in the vegetation and flora space by their 30 years of research that still are open issues for fauna. So what still needs to be agreed is understanding what appropriate reference conditions are, and they may or may not actually overlap completely with the reference conditions that are being used for vegetation. We need to understand how we assess when the criteria are actually suitably similar to whatever that reference landscape condition is. And once we've understood those, we need to then determine how we can actually robustly monitor and where and when that monitoring has to happen and using what methods. So perfectly on time. Thanks.